Hello, everybody, and welcome to 15 Minutes. I'm your host, Michelle Perron, and here we are today with the wonderful Emmy Bright. Emmy is an artist who makes performances, drawings, prints, and zines that merge high theory, pop songs, psychoanalysis, comedy, art history, and philosophy. As she says, I champion the stupid, the wrong, and the failed narrative. I love that. Emmy is currently artist in residence and co-head of print media at Cranbrook Academy of Art here in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. And she lives in Detroit and is represented by David Klein Gallery. And she has a show that just opened at davidkleingallery.com. So welcome, Emmy. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh my God, you're my first victim. So
ready and willing.
It's going to be fun. So, hey, everybody's wondering how the COVID pandemic has forced you to pivot, in your teaching. I mean, it's any kind of art teaching is very hands-on, very, much a group activity. How has it changed for you?
Oh, it's changed radically. I think especially for Cranbrook, which is a studio-based MFA program, so much of our work is in person and in the shops and looking and holding each other's work and talking about it. It's changed quite a lot. And it's been, I'd say, for the students who are sent home, super heartbreaking. So I think a lot of the teaching that I'm doing with my teaching partner, Cooper, has been really oriented towards support. How can we help you continue to think about your work? How can we help you write about your work? How can we help you translate your work to a digital form, even if you've always been a, tried and true printmaker in the shop? What does it look like to have to submit a PDF for crit? So I'd say our emphasis is absolutely on support, and in some ways, I mean, it's a very feminist mode of teaching, to meet students where they're at. Some students are sick in bed and we're talking to them for a couple minutes, but so I think it's the only moral way to continue, given the stresses in everyone's life. Like, the only, in my opinion, moral way to teach is to teach responsively right now. And, like everyone else, we didn't sign up for this. We didn't plan this. Our students didn't sign up for this, but they're really being champs. They're really being champs and doing what they're able to do, and they want to support each other too. And I honestly think that's been really beautiful.
Yeah.
Really beautiful.
Good. Tell me, how does teaching play or factor in your own art practice?
Well, it's interesting. When I was going to graduate, so I'm an education nerd through and through. I have a degree in education and studied quantitative research. And yeah, absolutely. And initially, when I went to graduate school years ago, the thought was, and I've always been engaged with community practices and community arts, and I like collaboration. And initially, I thought the purpose of coming to graduate school was, finally, these worlds will come together. My art making and my teaching will be one seamless practice. And the thing that I actually figured out was they're not. They actually live best as separate practices. I think the way I need to be responsive to others in my teaching, I have to let my studio practice take that space to be privately in touch with myself and my own rage or disappointment or heartbreak. And so I think the one way it might be connected is a lot of my artwork really at some level is about psychology and relationships and how do we label different kinds of thinking and yearning and feeling. And so those are kind of didactic and cognitive and emotional cares. So in that sense, they're very sort of teacherly concerns, but it was actually like a great blessing for me to come to figure out my art practice is a space for myself and sometimes collaborators. And it is not only fine, but actually good for everyone involved to keep those two things in different rooms.
So, psychology does play a big role in your work. And I'm curious, like, what your resources are, books and magazines and websites, and you know, what kind of therapy. And you know, it's really interesting to me, the psycho aspect of your work.
Yeah, I mean, I love that stuff. And I'll be quite frank, it's like I'm 12 years in on therapy and not stopping anytime soon. So, you know, I pull some things from my like understandings and misunderstandings of those kind of therapeutic conversations, but I'm also a huge nerd. I want to understand things. So I read Lacan and try to understand him. I read Freud and try to understand him. I love Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott are two favorites. I think Julia Kristeva is like a nutbag extraordinaire. And so I'm looking for people who've like crystallized some words and concepts and frameworks around impulses that I just feel. Because at least for me, and I think this comes from, I'm someone who I've always been a very emotional person, but was trained at University of Chicago and at Harvard to be this very rational, analytic person. And so a lot of the times my artwork is this like collision between those two. So trying to find like an analytical frame for the impossible, or trying to shove the impossible feeling into an analytic frame. And so those scholars, and I also love to read. And I think, and this is, I try to tell my students, if there's something that you love and you need in your life, if you can work it into your practice, phenomenal. I mean, there's things I love, like I like cooking in the kitchen. It's not part of my art practice, but I think for the sort of hard nerd that lives in my head, to be able to read for comfort and look to other people's ideas for comfort and try to find those crystallizations of the impossible or other people's abstract frameworks that I can then respond to visually, that's like, in some ways my studio is like a solitary thing, but it's also how do I be in conversation with all of these other thinkers in the world.
Yeah, you know, I want to get to your work because you have this new body of work online at David Klein, and it's interesting because it's in a sense sort of monochromatic or about color, with an absence of text. And text, of course, has always played a really important role in your work, but this has an abundance of materiality and texture and gesture. What changed for you?
Well, I think a couple of things. It's not an either or. So these are, the drawings up at David Klein have been happening over time for about 2 years. Alongside some of the more text-driven work that I've also been producing. They don't have text featured as prominently in the composition, but the titles are all pretty they're all very significant parts of the work. So to me, the way the text, even if it's a title, so one of them, you can kind of see this green piece behind me. It's sort of hard to see. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. That's a smaller version of a big piece. Can you see it?
Oh yeah.
That's called Cruel Optimism / Emerald City. And so when I first made that piece, and the piece follows a lot of the conceptual conceits of printmaking, the process of making and repetition. But when I saw it, I was just like overwhelmed with how green and how verdant and how full. And it just kind of made me feel a little ill. In that, or just like unhappy with how happy it was, or like unhappy with like how ebullient it was. It like doesn't match my view of the world, which is consistently at least registering minor, if not more depressive qualities. So for me, that piece couldn't exist without something to kind of like tether it into what I believe, which is that kind of overwhelming optimism does have a strand of cruelty and violence in it. So I think the balance between text and image, the monochromatic gesture to me is more of I think it's a way of rendering a kind of flat affect, or a flatter affect, while it has like a material beauty to it. And I think the text pieces too have a kind of deadpan, not overly emotional, like it's emotional stuff being expressed in a kind of flat way. So I think monochromes seem to do something similar. Yeah. But of course look very, very different. Yeah.
I've always thought of your work as sort of like Ed Ruscha painting the idea of language. you
Yeah.
know?
Oh my God. I love him.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, he's
And
the print hero, so he's a favorite.
yeah, totally. And he's a great guy too.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you sort of touched on the idea of dualities. There's so many sort of dualities that happen in your work, and I wonder if you can sort of talk about that. In your statement, you actually talk about where's the oh God, you said something that uh, ah um, oh well, talk about it.
Oh, are you talking about the statement for this show?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the work often comes out, or not often, there's different bodies of work which look different. You can pin them to different years or things I was sort of working on. But I'm always kind of obsessed with the same thing, which are the ways I think our brain likes making categories of self, other, good, bad, love, hate, more, less, all of these things which are the way that we navigate the world. And yet I think where I find myself getting stuck or finding like terrible anxiety is between these binaries. And I say that as a queer person, but also just someone who has like really strong thinking muscles and really strong feeling muscles, and then seeing those like battling in front of me at all times.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm always grappling with the sort of you, me, empathy, boundaries, because to go to an extreme of one, you don't have the other. And I think, the common, sort of self-help gurus are like, it's about balance. And I think for me, it's not about, I mean, maybe in the world it's about balance, but for me, it's about owning the paradox and owning that these things are fighting, and how do we watch them fight, and who wins, when, why. And the new body of work, the way it's made, and this is both printmaker, but has to do with dualities. It's one sheet is either painted or drawn with vertical lines, and one is with horizontal lines. And then they're stacked on top, and one shape is cut out of both. Mm-hmm. And then the shape from piece A goes into piece B, and B goes into piece A. So they're these elaborate inlay pieces, which are delightful to look at. But for me, I'm thinking about when I'm working them is just like, how does, especially in a relationship, how does one person's trauma become the other's to own or care for? How do the things from our parents come down to us to be ours but not ours? How are we separate and together? And I think, not to be trite, I think the COVID stuff that we're in now with lockdown shows just how connected and just how isolated we are in quite literal terms. But I think even on a regular day, both of those things are true. We're like horribly alone and horribly together.
Absolutely. And that's why this work it's so fortuitous that here it is now in this moment.
It is devastating. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really incredible, the timing of this. I do hope though that someday soon we can get to see the work in person, because it really, it looks online so luscious and deep and like you want to touch it, like you want to lick it or something.
I think it does. I think it is. It has this sort of like almost candy visual quality. And I think that is really, really different, that it's almost like a sensual engagement with emotion, whereas the more austere text work was a sort of like pointing at sentiment and suggesting sensation. But this invites a kind of like delicious, I don't know, sometimes grief can be like really terrible and delicious. I don't know. It has that stickiness to it, or sticky might not. I'm still working. It's pretty new, so I'm still working on it.
There's a certain beauty to pain and death and all of that. So, you grew up in New Haven, so around Yale. You went to the University of Chicago. You also went to Harvard before doing your master's at Cranbrook, in addition to Harvard. Was there a sense of duality for you growing up as LGBTQ, in the midst of these ivory tower institutions at all?
I would say with the institutions, it was more, I would say they're like, I haven't thought about like my queer identity in the context of institution. When I think about institutions that I went through, it's always been more, I think one of the earliest battles I remember is like thinking versus feeling. So in some ways that has to do with queerness and desire, but I could think myself into one kind of behavior and feel myself into another, but I couldn't think this and I couldn't feel this. And so I think that led to a kind of like splitting that made, I don't know, growing up and identifying hard for me in a way that maybe for some other people it wasn't, because they weren't so tied up in these concerns or maybe they were just braver, you know? Yeah, so I think I've always, I grew up thinking I wasn't super smart, but if I worked hard enough, maybe I could figure it out. And it was actually going to Harvard and studying education that I learned about. There's two models of how you can view intelligence, and one is that it's fixed, that you have what you have. Your IQ test at age 7 and your IQ test at age 40 are going to be the same. But the other view of intelligence is called incremental, and it's a belief that if you work hard on things, you can get smarter. And what's been shown is that those who hold a fixed view of intelligence tend to have their IQs stay the same over time, and those who have an incremental view of intelligence show that those IQ scores, which are all kinds of culturally biased, et cetera, but those do change over time. So it's not quite mind over matter, but it's those kinds of conflicts and complexities, and how does one know a thing? How does one really know a thing?
Right.
That has been kind of since I was really, really young, like, how should I be a person? How do I know what to study? Is art or art history? It's sort of like disengaged from desire and more about a logic problem. And I think as an artist, what I've been able to do is throw the logic problem and desire into the same frame and make them do something together.
This is so great, getting inside your head. I'm so happy. Last question. What's your, language factors so much in your life and your work. What's your favorite word?
Oh, I love the word scissors. And
Oh.
I think it's like onomatopoeia. It's totally like it does with its sound what it does in the world. So I think, again, it's that duality of function that it cuts, it sounds like it cuts, it like performs its own performance in its existence. So it's not a word I would use in my work, but it's been my favorite for a while.
That's so great. That is so great. Thank you so much, Emmy. It's been a real treat to sit down and talk with you, and we'll do it again. But for now,
thank you, Michelle.
It's been 15 minutes. So thank you.
I did fast and furious. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.